So next up, we have a tag team presentation. We've got the Texas A&M Natural Resource Institute put together and developed a really interesting tool on land trends in Texas. So we've asked Roel Lopez, the director of the Texas Natural Resource Institute, and Robert Mace, the executive director at the Meadows Center, to speak on that tool, what those trends show, and what that means for groundwater.
Howdy, howdy. We ready? Are we 6 foot apart?
I think you're, oh yeah, I am on.
Yeah.
Yeah, you look a little sickly, so I'm gonna stand over here.
I'll be all right. All right, well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. As was said, my name is Roel Lopez. I'm with the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute, and my colleague and friend here, Dr. Robert Mace, is with the Meadows Center at Texas State. So the charge that was given to us today is to talk about changes in rural land, changes in farms, ranches, family forests, and how that impacts groundwater. And so we're going to tag team this. Well, we'll kind of go back and forth here, but let me start by just telling you a little bit about Texas. 30 million Texans rely on natural resources across the state. There's 171 million acres of a farm, a ranch, a family forest. And these rural lands provide critical resources to all of us, ranging from air, recreational opportunities, food, fiber, carbon, and of course, water. And so there's obviously a connection between what happens on the land and the condition of the land to what happens in the ground with regards to water. And so as managers, it's imperative for us to look at changes in rural lands and what those changes mean in terms of the implications to our water resources, specifically our groundwater resources. And the three things that we're going to sort of frame our presentation on are the fact that Texas is going to have more people. That's going to impact the land. I use the term land infrastructure, right? Land is infrastructure, and those changes will impact a variety of resources to include water. And of course, in Texas, there's a large group of individuals that steward these lands, these private lands, these farms and ranches, which play a really critical role. And so with that, any opening remarks?
So I'm going to be more of a Greek chorus on here, but as you all know, groundwater is a distributed resource, and by that I mean it is spread clear across the state. The state is blessed with a number of aquifers and groundwater resources, and so however rural lands go, so goes groundwater resources, and many of you are experiencing some of these challenges with a growing and urbanizing state.
Well said. So one of the things that we're going to use as a basis for our presentation is changes in rural lands, using some data that at A&M we've collected and have analyzed for the last 20 plus years that we call Texas land trends. So some of you may be familiar with that. And what that data set is, for the most part, is the marrying of two data sets. The first is county tax appraiser data, and the second is the ag census data. The ag census data comes out every 5 years. And so you'll notice some of the years tied to the data is on 5-year increments, and it's for that reason. But through that relationship, we can understand changes in land value, changes in ownership, land use, and so forth. And the focus here for us are lands under ag valuation, 1D and 1D1 lands. So that's a common question people ask. And so the first slide here is what we see in Texas also occurs at other states. And there's a change in rural working lands, in farms and ranches, that's driven by a strong economy, followed by more people, more Californians moving to Texas, an increase in demand for water, or an increase in demand for rural land. And as a result, there's an increase in land values, market values increase, which is an early predictor of an incentive to subdivide and eventually convert that farm and ranch to a subdivision, a strip mall, etc. And so that's the process. And again, nothing new here. But from a water perspective, it means what?
Well, water is weaved all through changes in the working lands. And so with a growing economy, we need more water. With the population growth, we need more water. And at the end of it, with fragmentation and conversion from working lands into suburban or urban lands, we need more wells. And I also put down there's more tanks. And surface water is also weaved through here, and sometimes that has a direct impact on groundwater, because if surface water is being intercepted, then that may be preventing recharge of groundwater in those aquifers where you have losing streams. But then also it could be impacting surface water resources, which then creates more pressure on the groundwater resources of the state. And for the record, I came here from Illinois, through New Mexico. You looked at me when you said California, and it was a dirty look. So, so I didn't know if you knew.
Same difference.
Okay, you heard some rumors about me or something. Okay.
All right. So that process, again, starts with the fact that our state has more people from Illinois, New Mexico, California, all of these other states. And that obviously impacts our resources in a very broad sense. So I like this slide because it really sets the stage on the value of private lands and the stewardship of private lands. 171 million acres. You hear the statistic, 95% of Texas is privately owned, right? You probably have heard that a lot. The statistic I like is 83% of Texas is a farm, a ranch, a family forest. That means 83% of annual rainfall falls on a farm or ranch in Texas, recharging our groundwater supplies and so forth, filling our streams and rivers and so forth. And so that, I think, is important when you look at the fact that Texas has 30 million Texans, and that number is growing. And this map here to the right shows the number of Texans that live in an urban center of some sort, as well as the number of Texans that live in a rural community there in that yellow-orange color. And lastly, 1% of Texans own 141 million acres of land. 1% of Texans, landowners, basically steward these lands. And so from that perspective, it's important in better managing these resources and working with landowners, at least from our perspective, in maintaining and sustaining these resources. So in looking at the land trends data over the last 25 plus years, again, we're sitting at about 30 million Texans. That's about a 57% increase. In looking at this map, you'll see some of the counties highlighted here with the black outline. The hotter the color, that's where we're seeing the greatest increase in those population changes. Not surprising, they're tied to and in and around these urban centers. And so, again, that's one of the trends, more people and they're clustering in and around these urban centers. When you look at changes in rural versus urban Texans, and I don't like pitting the two between each other, but there are about 90% of Texans live in these urban centers. And so from a rural community perspective, from a groundwater district perspective in these rural communities, it's harder to sort of have a voice in this landscape or in the sea of increasing pressures. Bad news is, if you thought traffic was bad, it's only going to get worse. So 30 million Texans in the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to see a doubling of the population in the state. And there's no signs of that decreasing. And so, again, that means more and more pressure on various resources to include water.
Water. So this is a plot I stole from the brand spanking new 2022 State Water Plan that's now available at the Texas Water Development Board's webpage. And this is a classic plot you have seen, those of you who've been around for a while, for many years as the new plans come out. It is showing projections of water demand in that red line from 2020 through 2070. And then existing supplies in that dashed blue line. Ideally, of course, you want that dashed blue line above your demand line. And if it isn't, then it means we've got some work to do. This is a It's a great plot, but damn the Ogallala if it doesn't mess up everything. You know, it's there's a lot hidden behind this plot. You know, at first blush, and I hear this from folks, particularly folks outside Texas, like, wow, you guys, that massive population growth, that doubling of population, but your demand is staying the same. Well, not quite. Next slide. I like having you advance the slides for me.
You bet. Anything for you, Robert. Let me know.
So the Ogallala has a major impact on the results or summaries of water in the state. Just side tidbit, the Ogallala provides 40% of all the water supplies in Texas. All, not just groundwater, all. On the groundwater, it's about 85% of all supplies. So this is showing the water needs. So this is where we need more water above and beyond our current supplies. And you can see that there is indeed a large increase in municipal supplies, which is the red part of the bar. And then you have a need for additional irrigation supplies, which that is, again, mostly driven by needs in the Ogallala because we're pumping it at 6.5 times the rate the water is coming back in.
Okay. So, kind of a grim picture, right? More people, greater demand on our water resources and so forth. Going back to the land, so what happens with regards to sustaining these more rural landscapes, which from a water perspective are more beneficial and more sustainable in maintaining water resources long term, is we're seeing more and more of these type of signs. It's the breakup of farms and ranches and so forth. As I said earlier, one of the early predictors of conversion, fragmenting, taking 1,000 acres, breaking it up into smaller segments, and then ultimately selling a segment or two, or maybe all of it, and so forth, is market value. And so over the last 20 years or so, you can see the values there. The hotter the color, the greater the change in value. Statewide, we've seen an increase in cost per acre of about $1,500 per acre. This is statewide, but in some of these areas that are in and around these urban centers, that could be 300% to 400% increases in values. And so, not surprising, when you have that level of demand and pressure on these rural lands, there's an incentive to subdivide. When you subdivide a property, you can actually get more on a per acre basis than if not. And at some point you reach a point where that converts into a strip mall, a subdivision, etc. One of the things I oftentimes say is the last crop that we'll plant in Texas is asphalt. Asphalt will be the last crop that we plant. And so that obviously has ramifications for the conservation and management of lands, rural lands in particular. This slide kind of shows you where most of this breakup is occurring. Not surprising, they're in and around these urban centers. That's where the demand is, and everyone wants a piece of Texas, especially these folks from Illinois, New Mexico, California. They all want a little piece of Texas, and they race over, and voila, they have it. And so the ultimate conversion is the ultimate impact, right? In the last 20 some odd years, we've lost about a little over 2.1 million acres, and there's no sign of that slowing down. We're preparing for the 2022 Ag Census data, which again, we do these estimates every 5 years because of the nature of that data. But what's interesting about that, we were talking about COVID and what are the implications of that. There's data that's suggesting that we're learning that we could work from home. And why am I living in Austin with crazy housing prices when I could live outside of Austin on 10 acres or 5 acres or 100 acres?
With crazy housing prices.
Right? So there's been this shift occurring
yes.
that we're seeing in some of these rural communities, and broadband, I hate to say, kind of accelerates that in some regards because we can work from home. Right before the session here, I was teaching class to 100 Aggies back in College Station. And so, we live in a very different world where you can do things of that sort. And so that causes some shifts in land use and demands. And so from a water perspective, more people, greater demand on the land, more straws in the ground means
more wells, more groundwater production, and more groundwater management challenges. When I was working with Roel and putting this presentation together, I was thinking, where can I show, maybe increased wells and with increased growth? And the Water Development Board, since 2001, has been getting all the submitted well drillers reports. So this should be every well drilled since 2001 in the state. And without doing any kind of filtering, you can see that there is a clustering around these urban areas. It almost lines up perfectly with kind of where you were showing increased values and property and things like that. There's some other things going on here. Looks like they're always drilling wells in the Ogallala, probably replacement wells and stuff. But there's definitely more wells. If you had a 1,000-acre ranch that Roel referred to earlier, maybe you got a ranch house with a well and a few windmills. But once that gets broken up into 1,001-acre lots, you might have 1,000 wells providing water, and that greatly increases those costs. We don't talk about it much, but there's also, with fragmentation, the sad loss of habitat for wood apes out in East Texas.
Yeah, there's an inside joke.
Okay.
Wood apes or Sasquatch is the other common name for it. There is a relationship with wood apes and wells, we have found.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
okay.
true.
Next year's conference.
Note to self, don't give a presentation with Robert. Got it. All right. It's hard to look at you straight and thinking, wood apes, really? You said that?
Yeah, wood apes.
All right, excellent. All right, so more people, greater demand on our land. And there's another aspect to all this that maybe many of us don't think about often, is the fact that there's changes in our landowners. Remember I mentioned that you've got 250,000 plus or minus landowners that steward 83% of the ranches and farms in this state. And when you look at the demographics of those landowners, this is nationally. The average farmer is about 57 years old. The average forest landowner is about 65 years old. In Texas, it's actually higher. It's between 65 to 67 years old. And so what's happening, and it started a few years ago but continues, is in our state, we're seeing the largest intergenerational transfer of rural land in its history, in the history of the state, in the history of the country. And what that means is, who's going to be the future landowner with these changes and demand and so forth? Many of the family members don't want to stay on the land anymore. A younger generation, less tied to the land, different goals and objectives. New ownership is about 25% in Texas. Absentee ownership, meaning they live in Austin or San Antonio, but maybe have the family farm outside of town, is about 40%, 35 to 40%. And so again, I put a water bottle there for you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so
you
can, maybe you could tell us.
Good Carrizo Wilcox water.
I looked for a Texas supplier.
Yeah, that's good.
I was paying attention to the details, Robert.
Awesome.
Just want you to know that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So tell us about water.
So on the water side, I guess with the fragmentation and new ownership, and particularly the absentee ownership, and my impression, having kind of gone on a field trip to the demonstration site out in West Texas when I was with the Water Development Board, was there's a lot of absentee owners there. And it got passed down to the kids, and the kids now live in Houston or Dallas or Austin, or maybe it's speculative buyers. But they're more driven by income from that property, and so they may not be as driven on conserving water or managing groundwater. Their goal is, obviously not in all cases, but their goal is in general to kind of maximize returns on that investment. And so they're not there at the land, seeing what's happening to the wells every year, getting involved locally. with water conservation.
So we're going to show you a couple more slides that starts to kind of bring some of this together. Not surprising when you look at the projected water needs for the next 30, 40 years in the state, the darker the color, the greater the shortfall from the state water plan. And again, part of it is tied to region and where uses are, but part of it is certainly tied to these urban centers. These urban centers and this urban-rural fringe really has significant impacts with regards to the management of groundwater. And again, many of you in this room understand and know that, but that's only going to accelerate and continue moving forward. So this actually is that map that I showed you before that shows you the risk of a piece of property converting, okay? So the hotter the color, the greater the risk. Again, not surprising, it's in and around these urban centers. But then we also laid up the water shortage in 2070 moving forward. And so the bigger the dot, the greater the shortage. And again, there's some differences, right, Robert, with regards to this urban-rural interface versus an area like the Panhandle.
Yeah, so those of you that are involved with groundwater districts that are at that urban-rural interface, know there's the growth in population, so there's more straws in the ground, those are management issues. But then also, on that previous slide, you saw a lot of those water needs were in the urban cores. And most of our cities, if not all of them, have used up their local resources, so they're having to reach out to find more. And they're reaching out to the rural areas. Probably the most famous example of that is San Antonio reaching out northwest of Austin to the Carrizo-Wilcox with the Vista Ridge project. And so, as it gets harder and harder to get water, there's that potential. And then also, the Middle Pecos district is not exactly near a bustling metropolis. Sorry to any Fort Stockton. Fort Stockton's a very nice town, by the way. Great wine bar there, and you get some good tacos. But even there, because it's so water poor, consortium of cities, including Midland, are seeking to export water from that area. So even if you're a district and you have a good resource, especially if it looks like a sustainable one, there's a little bit of a target on your back in terms of thirsty cities looking for that water.
All right, so we'll start to wrap it up here with some final thoughts, and then maybe we can have a conversation. The trend that we're seeing in the state, not surprising, is the fact that we've got more and more people. That trends, there's no signs of that changing or slowing down. And the result is impacting, and I use the term land infrastructure, right? We often think of pipes and tanks and power lines as infrastructure. Land is infrastructure. You stop and think about it. It serves to capture water when it's stewarded properly, and it puts water into the ground. And so when that land infrastructure starts to be strained and so forth, it impacts the amount of water that's captured and managed in a better way. The changes in landowner perspectives, I think, is something that we need to be very much aware of, because again, that's probably one of the largest challenges in Texas with regards to sustaining rural lands. Land conservation is the fact that we just have this shift in land ownership. And lastly is communicating the public benefits of private lands. We oftentimes just look at private lands as food and fiber, but not beyond that. But I live in Bexar County, and I understand and appreciate that the water that comes out of my spigot comes out of an aquifer or a river that may be recharged from a farm, a ranch outside of town. And so I think having and communicating that relationship with folks can serve in better managing these water resources.
Yeah, and one thing that's even maybe a little more unique about the Edwards Aquifer than for other aquifers in the state is Edwards Aquifer has a catchment zone. So the hill country acts as a water funnel to move water in. And so there's even a water quality aspect there, and also some debates and concerns about wastewater treatment disposal into hill country streams and what that might do to water quality. Some final thoughts on the water side. We've already talked about the need for more water. There's more fragmentation, which probably leads to more wells. But want to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of some thoughts I have that traditional methods of permitting do not work at the urban-rural interface. I kind of feel like the DF's, the desired future condition process, came along on top of groundwater districts and how groundwater districts did things. And I'm going to overgeneralize because this doesn't apply to all districts, but bear with me, is that most districts are managing rural groundwater resources. So they don't have, or y'all don't have that, generally have that major demand that has come in. And so you're given a big permit maybe to some farmers, maybe you're given a big permit to the local town, the county seat, and then the rallying cry was prevent state control. So maybe you're there to keep the state from taking control of your local groundwater resources. A lot of districts were formed after Senate Bill 1 passed in '97, and I think a lot of those were formed because of concerns about groundwater export. Maybe that's why the district was originally formed. But when a district finds itself suddenly, in the grasp of the urban-rural interface, now all of a sudden here comes a bunch of big users that want the water, or maybe there's a water marketer that wants that water. And so before you're dealing with small permits, now you're dealing with a big permit, and your rules aren't set up to manage to achieve the desired future condition, or to keep pumping below the modeled available groundwater number. And so you have to give that permit, but then someone else comes in right behind him looking to file for a big permit. And so I see that there's challenges there for districts. Now there are some models out there that some districts are doing to try and address this situation. I saw Gabe Collins here earlier. He has a paper in the Texas Water Journal. There he is, a way to do that. Post Oak Savannah has an approach that they're using. And there are some districts like Barton Springs that do have caps there. But if you're a district and you're in the rural-urban interfaces moving your way, I would encourage you to take a strong look at your rules and ask yourself the question, what happens when someone big walks in and wants a sizable chunk of our water? We talked about absentee owners, but I just wanted to talk briefly about climate change. With the warming that's expected, it's expected there'll be a lot more evaporation. Soil moisture is going to go down, which means less runoff in the reservoirs, less recharge to our aquifers in general. And that's going to put more and more pressure on groundwater resources. And if you look at kind of the big thinkers about water resources under a climate change scenario, they're pointing at groundwater for meeting those needs in a much more uncertain world in the future. So just be aware that that's coming as well.
All right, so if you're interested in any of the information that we shared, there's our websites there, and we may have time for questions, I assume. All right.
Yep, we do.
So I don't have a mic, so if you guys can, I got a couple in.
Okay.
Sure.
See if there are any from the audience, and then if there are none from the audience, I've got a couple here, and I'll just ask you to repeat whatever questions are given.
Will do. Anybody in the audience have a question?
Yeah, it's hard to see with the lights.
Yeah, it's a shy. Oh, here we go. I got a question over here.
Sure, that's a great question. The question is, when I gave the statistic 1% of Texans own the majority of farms and ranches, the caveat is lands under ag valuation, so 1D, 1D1. And so we don't count homeowners and so forth because obviously all of us are landowners in that mix. So these are just folks that are managing 10 acres and above. So anything, typically counties have a threshold, like a 5-acre tract doesn't count under ag valuation for the most part, majority of counties. And so that's not included in the mix. That's a great question, though. Yes, sir. Yep. So the question or comment really was, 1D1 includes wildlife valuation, and that could include some developers that maybe maintained it under wildlife valuation for, let's say, 1,000 acres, but then there's individual homeowners. But most of the county tax appraisers they get up on that and try to correct that. So there may be some cases where there's a little bit of that, but for the most part, it's an individual landowner that's managing. Under wildlife valuation, you have to have a plan that's submitted to the county tax appraiser for that.
Yeah, but every one of those houses has a well.
Right? I think that was Robert's, yep, absolutely.
So I've got a few here that came from my trusty phone.
All right.
The first one is, in light of what y'all have shown here, do we need to reconsider the exemption for domestic wells?
It's a great Robert Mace question. Man.
The question is given what y'all saw in the presentation, do we need to reconsider the exemption given to exempt wells?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah, that's a good, I want to hear this answer.
I don't have an opinion on that.
Oh, no opinion.
I think it'd be pretty. I'm not an attorney either. Let's see what other questions. And I'm from Illinois.
Yeah.
Originally. I think my guess is it would be pretty hard to remove that from statute. It's kind of like it's almost like a riparian right that if you own land and there's water underneath it, you have a level of right of accessing it. Not to mention that groundwater is a private property right. I think in general that usage is not much on a homeowner by homeowner or landowner by landowner basis, but for certain aquifers, and particularly the Trinity, you can find yourself overwhelmed due to limited recharge or limited production from those. So I'm ducking the question. Ask Chairman Perry on Thursday.
I'll be sure to. Another one that came, I'm going to read this one, and I apologize. So converting from ranch or forest to municipal use would increase water usage. But given that irrigated agriculture is so water intensive, converting that land to municipal use seems like it could reduce water demands. So how does that play into what these trends mean for water?
So the question is we talked about ranch or farmland. Really, this is more farmland, specifically irrigated farmland, but farmland moving into suburban, urban development. There's greater demand for water, and there may be more wells. But if that land is irrigated, could there actually be less use of water? I guess my knee-jerk response to that is that I don't know that there's a whole lot of that conversion of irrigated agriculture to urban on the groundwater side. I'm not saying it's not happening. I think some of it's happening around San Antonio.
Or the valley.
The valley, surface
river.
water, so I qualified with the groundwater there. But yeah, the valley, that certainly happens. But like around Dallas-Fort Worth, there's not a whole lot of irrigated agriculture. Around Houston, I guess there could be some on the east side, rice farms. I don't know that rice farms are being bought out. Do you know?
No, and Uvalde and so forth. I guess my response to that is, and I think this graph kind of illustrates that, certainly there's an impact there, but when it comes to irrigation and so forth, they tend to implement conservation practices and so forth that sort of curbs a little bit of that. But I think just from a municipality point, and I think to this gentleman's point earlier, when you have multiple homes, I mean, it's an increase in demand, consistent through the year and so forth. It would be my response.
I guess I'm thinking like if you had, so let's say it was irrigated land on the Edwards, so they're an ag user, irrigator is permitted 2 acre-foot per acre, which is quite a bit of water. They probably typically really use 1 acre, but I think you can convert the full 2 to the market if it's completely getting developed. And I don't know, seems like an average family uses about 0.3 acre-feet per year. Is that right? Anybody? You know? True, true.
Right. So that's a good point. And to the question, his comment was, you may see this graph, and there's an increase in municipality use, but it could be complicated by the fact that a 5-10 acre ranchette or what have you is irrigating grass and landscaping and so forth, and so there may be an increase in use in that form, I guess.
So I had one other one come in, and you touched on it, Robert, about groundwater quality. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit more about the potential impacts to groundwater quality in the Edwards, but maybe outside as well.
Sure. So the karst system, so the Edwards, parts of the Trinity and outcrop are most susceptible to the water quality aspects, as well as impacts to recharge zones. Because I know that there's, in general, I think there's some special TCEQ rules about protecting kind of those features and keeping poor water quality from getting into the aquifer. But there are those concerns. You have septic tanks. San Marcos Springs, that's right outside my office, has trace amounts of cocaine in it.
Not surprising.
Yeah, there's microcontaminants in that water. Now, you drown yourself before you got a buzz.
Right. Painless. Yep.
So that's, so even there, the development, depending on what's going, and even a centralized wastewater infrastructure leaks, and so you get impacts there as well. So it's less of a concern in other aquifers because I think I read where it's maybe on average 800 years for recharge to get from the land surface, or water to get from the land surface down to the water table in the Ogallala. So we can just push that off on future generations. But
All right, are there any other questions from the audience? I see one in the back there, I think.
I see one in the back there.
Yes, at this website here.
And then someone else in the back over here got up.
That's a good question. So the question is, conservation easements is a tool that's used in the conservation of rural lands. And what it is it's a voluntary agreement that the landowner, in working with a given organization, purposely restricts certain types of development. You can live on it, farm it, ranch it, et cetera, but the question is, could a conservation easement be used to limit the number of wells? And I think the answer is sure. If a landowner wants to do that, they could moving forward. So every conservation easement is tailored specific to that landowner and so forth. So that certainly could be something that could be weaved in that way.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. And it kind of also sparks, what are things that could be done about what we've talked about today, and using water more efficiently in urban environments, the whole one water concept of capturing urban water and using that where at all possible. So San Antonio is really good about capturing air conditioning condensate, rainwater harvesting to meet indoor supplies. City of Austin just built a new building where it has an on-site skid-based black water treatment system. And so it's going to capture its sewage coming out of the building, treat it, and bring it back in to flush toilets and urinals. And so more advanced water conservation techniques like that can reduce the water footprint of our urban centers and decrease the need to reach out to the rural areas, whether it's for reservoirs or for well fields, and therefore minimizing impacts on rural systems.
All right.
All right.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.